Yo, what's up, y'all? This is Tech Slim. Jude's holding his knife and smiling at me. We are doing a podcast about, what is it, Matthew 5? Yeah, they nod their head yes. So, Jude, what do you got to say about this?
So I'm out here on the back porch, and I've invited my dad to join us. We're going to be discussing Matthew chapter 5. This will be a 2-part podcast, and this is part 1, where we're going to talk about the classic 3 sections that the Torah is divided into, and how that's usually applied to Matthew 5.
He didn't mean to say 2-part episode, podcast, whatever. He meant to say 2-part episode because the podcast is many parts.
So Jesus has preached a little bit, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And then he starts out this chapter with the Beatitudes. Is his first big sermon. And then he says, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And there's one main way that the church has dealt with this passage through the years. And that is to say that the law he's referring to, the law that's left for us, is a moral law. And they divide the Torah into 3 parts: the moral, the ceremonial, and the legal. So, Papa, when you look at the Torah, is that what you find?
You can draw out some definite moral things, like in the 10 Commandments: thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. And you can definitely draw out some ceremonial things, like in the book of Leviticus, where it goes through all the sacrifices. That's very ceremonial. And what was the other one? Legal. You've got all kinds of regulations about if a man kills someone and he runs to the city of refuge and stuff like that. So there are definitely aspects of those 3 things in the Torah. But having said that, we're not making a PowerPoint here. We're actually trying to live. I mean, the whole point of theology is to give you a new way to live, right? So when you read Torah, I don't see it that cut and dried. There are long passages that emphasize more one thing than the other, but if you just read Torah cover to cover, it does not neatly divide into these 3 categories, in my opinion.
Right, that would be nice if it was, like you said, if it was just a PowerPoint presentation. And it's not a bad way to divide it if you want to make it, a slide presentation for a sermon, for instance. But you're right, when you really look at it, that's not what you see. And in Deuteronomy 22, we see all kinds of different commands, kind of random commands. It's like, oh, we forgot to put these in the other chapters almost. Woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak. What category does that fall under? It talks about if you see your brother's ox or a sheep gone astray, you should take it back to your brother.
Is that a legal requirement that you return your ox to the neighbor, or is it moral, or is it both?
Right. It's, you should not sow your vineyard with 2 kinds of seed. That's not ceremony. Is it legal? Not really. Is it moral? Mm. There's no...
Is there a category for mystery? Because there's some things we really don't understand.
Right, and speaking of other categories, there's also there's wisdom. So if you want to put out a bunch of categories, there's wisdom. There's also the feast days, and they don't really fall under any of the 3 classic declensions. They really need their own category.
Absolutely. Can you give an example of the wisdom that you're talking about?
Says if you come across a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, it says you can take the mother. It says you should not take the mother with the young, you should let the mother go.
Wow, that's so random.
Right.
It would really take wisdom to even understand how is that applicable to anything.
Right. And so even if this was cut and dry, just the fact that they're thrown in this like apparently haphazard manner, when we go into the Torah looking for these 3 distinctions, if these distinctions were there in in the mind of the Lord, or in Moses' mind when he organized them, they wouldn't be so random.
There are a lot of great ways to organize the Torah, but dividing it into moral, legal, and ceremonial is not naturally one of them. If you just read the whole thing, like you said, there are categories missing. So you could come up with 7 or 8 categories and then divide everything up, but it would be total chop suey.
Well, and not only that, but some of the categories would still overlap.
Well, tell me more. What do you mean?
Well, just like, to give an example, and let me see, in the next chapter here, from Deuteronomy 23, it says, if you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. So the vow, that's definitely ceremonial, but then there's the moral aspect. If you don't fulfill it, you'll be guilty of sin.
Why is the vow ceremonial too?
Because it requires sacrifice.
Okay,
it's an animal sacrifice.
Right. So you just can't easily divide it up. You've got strands of yarn mixed with pieces of spaghetti, and you've got all that mixed with
Horsehair.
Thank you, Caleb. Caleb loves horses. If you try to pull on one, you're going to... In fact, it's worse than spaghetti and yarn and horsehair. It's been baked into a casserole, and so they're all stuck to each other. You pull on one, you're going to pull out another. That's kind of how it reads, I guess. But maybe this has been applied to Matthew 5 because Jesus is more overt. Maybe he really does divide it. Like if he says, no, it's divided into 3 categories, and you should keep the moral, then my understanding of reading Torah can go out the window. Is that what you see, Jude, when you look at Matthew 5? Do you see this 3-part division evident there?
Yeah.
No, it's not what I see. In fact, in a way, I think Matthew 5 is even more... So some of the parts in Matthew 5 are even more mixed together than what we see in the Torah. He says if you're angry with your brother, you'll be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother Raka is answerable to the Sanhedrin. And so he's talking, morality there, but then he brings the legal aspect into it of the Sanhedrin. He says that, if you're offering your gift at the altar and they remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift in front of the altar, first be reconciled to your brother, then come offer your gift. So he's bringing in the moral and the ceremonial there.
Okay, so Jesus is telling people sacrifice these animals while doing the moral life of the Torah.
Right, and he's certainly not making a distinction here. And if he was trying to make a distinction, that would be a terrible job of it, to mix the moral and the sacrificial in those 2 verses.
Okay, this begs the question: if there's not an obvious reason to divide up Torah into the moral, legal, and ceremonial on its own basis, and there's no obvious reason in Matthew chapter 5 to divide it up, why, for hundreds of years, have Christians been pushing back and dividing it up that way? And there's got to be some kind of other reason, because it doesn't jump out from the text. I don't know. What's the motivation here?
I'm not sure. I think there's an assumption that, we're not supposed to follow the whole Torah. So but of course we also know, intuitively you could say, like C.S. Lewis talks about, we know moral right from wrong, and so we know that we have to follow that. And so because there's the assumption that we can't be following the Torah, this is kind of assumed and superimposed onto the text, I think.
It feels that way just because we don't see it in Matthew 5, and in fact, we'll get to this in the second part, but he actually says, not only he doesn't say do just the moral aspects of Torah. He in fact says to follow all the commands of Torah, even the smallest of them. So it does seem like it's not there. So go ahead.
Real quick, one other thing. Just another example of two. It's so and in verse 25 it says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you're still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge.
So another legal reference in the middle of a moral.
Right, and not only that, but wisdom too. I mean, that sounds like it could be in the book of Proverbs as well. So there's another that is anything but cut and dried.
Gotcha. Okay. Any others jump out at you?
Let me see. Well, of course, there's moral on top of moral. He says, you've heard it was said, do not commit adultery.
Hello, Jesse.
Hey, Jesse, what's up? Am I interrupting something? No, we're doing a little podcast. What's up? Oh, shoot, my bad. All right, Caleb's doing a little bicycle pump for Jesse. Thank you, Caleb.
Okay, I lost my train of thought.
You were talking about moral upon moral.
Right. So, he says, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So here it's all moral, but he's expounding upon what's already there, and he's not teaching to do any less.
Right. More than the minimum.
Right.
If it's not natural in Torah, it's not natural in Matthew chapter 5. Do we at least see other early Christian leaders like the apostles living according to this moral Torah only? Do we see them discarding the ceremonial? Do we see them discarding the legal aspects of this? I mean, which aspects do you see lived out in the early church, and which aspects do you not? Because obviously they were there, they heard Jesus' original words. So can you think of any times in the New Testament, Jude, where you see Peter, James, Paul, other leaders of the church, or the church in general, living out only the moral versus the other aspects of the Torah?
No, I can't. There's a part where Paul is arrested in the temple while he is there taking a vow with some other brothers, which includes animal sacrifice. And that's certainly not moral.
No, so he's participating in animal sacrifice. We're talking like how many years after the death of Christ? Like this is
like how many is it?
I don't know. I'm thinking 25. I think Acts covers between 28 and 38 years. There are different ways of interpreting it. So this is when he's arrested in the temple courts before he ends up going on his journey to Rome and all this, right?
Right.
So this is probably a good 20 to 30 years after the resurrection. Here's Paul sacrificing animals in the temple.
Right.
What in the world could be going on there?
Well, first thing is he certainly can't be just trying to win converts. He's not trying to just be, all things to all people, because he's doing this with other believers. And not only that, but Papa, explain what happened right before this.
Oh, right before the whole reason he went to the temple, I guess, is James pulled him aside and he said, some people, Paul, are saying that you teach against the Torah. And to prove them wrong and to show that you're a full supporter of Torah, would you pay for the sacrifices? And I think I figured it up a couple years ago. It was probably $800 per man. So $3,200 for the 4 guys, plus his own cost. So here's Paul spending $4,000 to support the Torah and to show the church in Jerusalem, these Christians, that he is in support of Torah. Can you even, how does this even compute? Why is Paul doing this? Has he lost his conscience? Has he given up his freedom in Christ?
No. And like you're saying, this would have been a perfect opportunity for him to say, well, no, that's done away with. For him to say that's a purely ceremonial aspect that's done away with.
Right.
And he could, he could have made a point out of it. He could have said, well, James, I am teaching that to an extent, but he didn't. And obviously, my dad brought this up earlier. He's not afraid of conflict. He confronted Peter, and he's obviously very bold in his letters as well. So he's not afraid of conflict.
Right. So he didn't just kowtow to James or try to win converts, but he really seems to be living out a full Torah life 25 years after the resurrection, which doesn't compute with that only carry on the moral aspects of Torah. Anybody else in the New Testament you see, living out Torah life more fully than just the moral? Let me think here. Okay, what about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul is instructing the church in Corinth, which we largely think of as a Greek church, to celebrate the Passover festival. And obviously that's not a moral thing to celebrate Passover, right?
Right.
It's kind of ceremonial. It's kind of it can fit into one of those other categories you were talking about. But yeah, that's not moral. And he's telling the Christian church post-resurrection to celebrate what we think of as a Jewish holiday, but it's part of the Torah.
Right. Any other examples you see?
Oh, there's going to be a couple. I'm trying to rack my brain. Let's see. Talk about Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council. Do you think that could be an example? I mean, does that fit into what we're talking about?
Yes, that's a good point. So in Acts 15, Peter stands up and he's saying, guys, we shouldn't impose circumcision on the Gentiles. This was hard enough for our forefathers. And James stands up. He's like, yes, I agree with that. He says, I think we should write to the churches and tell them to just do 4 things to begin with. He says they should abstain from meat with the blood still in it, from the meat of strangled animals. And
wait, is that moral?
No.
That's not a moral issue, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, from meat with the blood still in it, from meat sacrificed to idols, meat of strangled animals, and sexual immorality. Well, 3 of those 4 are not moral. And 2 of them, 2 of them have to do with sacrifices to other gods. One of them, meat with the blood still in it, that's totally not a moral command, and that's one of the seemingly 4 most important things to James. And no one there disagrees with him, and they end up writing that in letters and sending that out to the church, that those are the 4 things that the converts ought to do. And then he says, after he lists those 4 things, he says, for the law of Moses is taught in every synagogue, implying that these converts are going to be going to the synagogue still and learning the rest of the law of Moses.
Okay, so that's at the end. I don't remember the exact wording, but I remember what you're saying. So he's like saying, start with these 4 things. These are the most important things that are affecting your daily life, you Gentiles. And if you can just start with these, then don't worry, the rest of Moses is taught in all kinds of synagogues. You're going to pick up the rest of Torah. Now, this is the brother of Jesus and the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And this is like 53 or 52 AD, I believe. So a good 22 years after the resurrection, the brother of Jesus is telling new converts, just start with these aspects of Torah that are not moral, and you'll pick up the rest of Torah in the synagogue as you learn and grow. That's pretty blatant.
Right. And not only that, he's saying this in front of Paul and Peter and all the other leaders, and other apostles, and nobody stands up and contradicts him. And they agree, and they send it out in the letter.
You'd think that somebody would have stood up if in fact, from Matthew 5, we're supposed to take away just the moral aspects of Torah, that Peter would have stood up and said, no, wait a minute. We remember Jesus' words. He said that we needed to not commit adultery and not hate our brother, but this business with meat with blood in it and strangled animals and learning the rest of Torah at synagogue, that's a little extreme. We've been set free from all that, but you don't see that.
Right. No one contradicts him. He says it. I'm just going to read verse 21. So in verse 20 of Acts 15, he says, he lists the 4 things. And verse 21, he says, for Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on Sabbath. And so we can see by that, they were going to the synagogues as well as meeting in their homes throughout the week. And I also love that, James isn't super concerned with them learning the rest of the Torah. He's like, don't worry, it's taught in the synagogues. They're going to get around to it. He's not concerned with throwing it all on them at once. He says, it's okay. They're gonna get this as time goes by.
So it's a very graceful approach to Christians learning the Torah.
It is, absolutely. He's not trying to force it all on them.
I just got to point out that's the big accusation that people who follow the law are legalistic and people who don't are full of grace. But the two don't have to be in contradiction, and this is a beautiful picture of that.
Right. And if they really are always opposed to each other, then that would mean that the people before Jesus were not saved by grace. But we know they are. They weren't saved by works. So the two can't always be diametrically opposed.
Speaking of things that you see the leaders in the early church doing with Torah, what you never see them doing with Torah is trying to use it to gain salvation or justification for someone.
Right, and that's something that's one of the biggest things that Paul talks about, is he emphasizes that, that's not what we're justified by.
Alright, boys, this is a little rewrap enchilada. What do you call it?
What?
Of the whole thing of what we've learned so far.
So, just to summarize, when we look at the Torah with this lens of these three different types of commands, this isn't what we see. Instead, we see a total mix with a lot of these, principles of moral and legal and ceremonial overlapping, and we see some that don't seem to fit in the category at all. Instead, there seems to be not much of a distinction made between them. And same within Matthew 5. We see examples in Matthew 5 of Jesus using both, moral and legal, and both moral and ceremonial in the same examples. And just the fact that he's using those at all, when he's supposedly talking about just the moral aspect, tells us something. And then we see people in the New Testament not just living by the supposed moral standard, but they're also living according to these ceremonial laws as well.
They're living a full Torah life to the extent that they can, and it's kind of the expectation for Christians in the New Testament.
Right. So this was episode 1, and episode 2 will come back and we'll look in depth at Matthew chapter 5.